Welcome to Your Idaho, brought to you by the Gem State Patriot. My name is Bob Neugebauer. My guest today is Dr. Jim Brook, a family practice physician from Idaho Falls. Jim, it's nice to have you with us today.
Thanks.
I just finished reading your book, this one here, for all those who haven't seen it, haven't read it. It's a great piece of reading material. And I found that the high price of socialized medicine, as it was quite intriguing. This topic is very important to our state because of the large number of our citizens, 246,000 to be exact, who are currently enrolled in the Medicaid program. And the legislature is looking at adding what they think will be 78,000 more to Medicaid expansion. You have an entirely different approach to the health care issue than any other physician I know. And I wonder if you might explain to our viewers just how you started in medicine and why you chose this unusual route to take.
Well, actually, I started as a socialist myself, in favor of universal health care was the buzzword then. Now it's single payer. But I realized during my training what damage those programs are doing to the people of the country, even the ones it's supposed to be helping. And it's really the cause that health care has become so expensive in the first place. Compare it to, say, electronics that are in a free market. Go to the home of any so-called poor person in the U.S., and you see 50-inch plasma TVs and computers, cell phones for all the kids. They can afford those things because they're made in a free market. Healthcare, they can't, because the government has gotten so entrenched, they've driven prices through the roof. And so I took another approach, and I realized that I could provide much, much more affordable healthcare by not taking any insurance in the first place and just keeping my fees low by keeping my overhead low, not having an army of clerks to try to collect my fees, and so I don't have to charge a lot.
So you don't take any insurance or any Medicare or Medicaid?
No.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about the type of patients that you attend to in your family practice?
Well, all kinds. From the waitress that you hear that can't get health care, has no access to health care, and then leaves me a tip because my health care is affordable and she appreciates the service, all the way up to the fairly well-to-do that are running decent-sized, successful companies and come to me because they want a more thorough service than they can get elsewhere.
So your patients are basically less wealthy, as you explain in your book.
Some of them.
Not poverty-stricken, as we would consider poverty, somebody hanging out in the streets. And in other words, many of them have homes, big screen TVs, air conditioning, all the modern conveniences, but would not be categorized as poor, yet they come to you. Would you think that a lot of these people, if they couldn't come to someone like yourself, would be looking to get into Medicaid expansion where they could get the freebies?
Probably. I've seen a lot of patients that have stopped going to doctors altogether, stopped treating their diabetes, hypothyroidism, things like that, or let a pneumonia go unchecked until they hear about me because they just couldn't afford to go to the doctor. Yet these people really aren't poor, as you were alluding to, I think. We don't have poor in America. We have wealthy and less wealthy. Let's take a look, for example, at what Robert Rector said that I quote here in this book on page 15. And put the glasses on for it. Of people below the official poverty line in the U.S., 43% own homes with an average of 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a porch or patio, and a garage. 80% have air conditioning. Only 6% of poor households are reported as overcrowded. 78% have a VCR or DVD player. Over half have a stereo. 89% have at least one microwave oven, etc. These are not poor people. Go to Bangladesh, go to Africa. You'll see poor people. We have wealthy and less wealthy, and these people can afford to pay reasonable fees for health care.
So basically what we're looking at here is a socialized system that we started and are still perpetrating back in the 1940s, where we were allowing employees to give insurance to employees because it was a perk and they needed the employees to stay with the company. And then it proceeded to the 1960s when Lyndon Johnson came along and wanted to create the Great Society. and we had more social welfare with Medicare. These are problems, and you believe that it is not the purpose of government to provide for people, but to secure them in their rights, and that Medicaid and Medicare should not be financed by taking that one taxpayer's money and giving it to another, which is just the opposite of what most physicians' philosophies are. And I can understand in some ways why they are that way, because that's the way they've grown up. That's what they've been doing all their lives. So they don't know anything different.
Right. Well, the founders of our country saw the purpose of government the same way, to just protect individuals from the aggressions of others against their persons and property. When you take the property from one to give it to another through government, you're defeating the very purpose government was created for. And take a neighborhood example. Suppose I see that my neighbor Virginia has some great need. Oh, she's desperate. She's in dire straits. And I go to my other neighbor, Will, and tell him, you have to give her money. He says, no. I pull out my gun and I say, no, you have to give her money. I should be thrown in jail. That's robbery. Suppose the neighborhood gets together and votes to go to Will and force him to give Virginia money. That's still robbery. How is it then that we can do the very same thing through government, delegate that authority that we don't have to our government to do on our behalf? We don't. It may be legal, but it's immoral.
I tend to agree with you. It's a very libertarian stance in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, we don't have a very libertarian government.
Libertarian is a word that some people see as radical. Well, our founders were radical. Thomas Jefferson was the ultimate libertarian, and so were most of our founders.
Yeah, but unfortunately, they're not around anymore. We now have the unfounders.
I think they wouldn't get 1% in a Republican primary these days.
Since you don't take Medicare or Medicaid or insurance, and you only deal in cash, do you find that your patients occasionally stiff you with a bill?
Well, I can count the number of times I can't collect from a patient on one hand, probably on two fingers for an entire year, in a typical year. My average tends to be 100% collected. Last year it was 101% because of tips.
And how many patients do you see on a daily basis?
Oh, maybe a dozen or so. I spend more time with people, and I collect all their information rather than having a nurse
and
do
what
it.
would you say the average cost is for a patient to come to you, get diagnosed, maybe need a medication or a lab work? What would that average out to for all your annual basis?
My average this year has been around $60, including labs and meds. That includes some complex things where people come to me to really dig into, figure out an issue that maybe another doctor hasn't been able to figure out. And it also includes the strep throat or thyroid follow-up or whatever. A typical coming in for an ear infection or a strep throat or whatever with an antibiotic in hand, they're out the door for about $40.
So you basically charge by the time you spend with the patient, but then you have to look at it from the viewpoint that the patient is getting direct care from the physician, not from a physician's assistant, not from a nurse, not from somebody else, but it's actually personalized, direct patient-to-doctor care, which you don't get very much anymore.
No. Most people get a PA or a different doctor or PA every time they go in. And so that results in repeated visits. I may not see as many per day as the average doctor, but the average doctor may have a patient coming back more often.
Yeah. In your book, you say that healthcare is driving our economy toward collapse. Why do you feel that way, and how do you think we could stop it or turn it around? I mean, we all know what Obamacare has done to us in the last 3-4 years.
Before Obamacare, a few years ago, the Social Security and Medicare trustees themselves said that we had $106 trillion in unfunded future obligations to pay our promises. Projected revenue minus shortfalls, big gap there. There's no way that could possibly ever be paid. That's about $1 million per household in America. That's impossible to pay. And it gets worse with every passing year. Obamacare is making it very much worse.
Well, Obamacare, as we've seen already, has added an enormous amount of pressure on our insurance industry, on our doctors, on our hospitals. I don't know how we're going to get over that and reverse it.
Right. And going back to what that would do to health care, just think of how bad our health would be if our economy collapses. Look at Zimbabwe. Their economy collapsed because of overprinting of money. Sound familiar? Are we printing a bit of money? Cholera came back in Zimbabwe. All you need to defeat cholera is clean water. Robert Snow, some guy last name Snow, a doctor in London, found that out in the 1800s.
Right, I remember reading that. It's just like it was back in the 1900s when they found out washing your hands caused a lot less infection when you're operating on a patient.
Right. So our health will collapse if our economy collapses. And we'll have no ability to defend the country. If your big thing is the military, defense, which I think is important, then we won't have that if we don't have a vibrant economy.
And we see more and more doctors disappearing every year as they get older. We already have a shortage here in Idaho, which we're all aware of. You say in your book that employer-sponsored health care is responsible for the problems we have today with our health care system, again, because the corporations permitted employees to deduct that from their taxes. This system's been in place since the 40s. We know we have a doctor shortage, and we know that we have one right here in our state. Just how bad is the problem, and what do you feel is the primary cause, and how do we go about solving this problem? And you've talked about this at committee hearings because I've listened to you. How do we change this, and what do we have to do to get this doctor shortage out of the way and to start treating people so that they actually get the necessary care, but they don't get all of this other garbage that goes with it?
Two answers. First, to address the first part of your question, it's actually not employer-driven, but tax deductibility-driven. Whether the tax deductibility of health insurance is for individual purchased or employer purchased, if the health insurance is tax deductible, it distorts the value relative to other things, and people want as much health insurance as they can get, which means getting every little thing covered, driving demand and cost way, way up. That's the primary driving factor of our healthcare woes. As far as the shortage is there because of government control over medical school positions and residency positions. Most people probably don't know this, but the Medicare program actually funds almost all of the residency positions in the U.S. And rheumatology is notorious for, no matter where you are in the country, it takes months to get into a rheumatologist unless you have some kind of emergency. Well, more people would study to become rheumatologists if they could in a free market situation. It used to be that residencies were funded by hospitals. They would have residents in their hospitals who would usually stay in the area bringing workers to the hospital.
Why is it that they don't fund them anymore? We have two very large hospitals here, just in the Treasure Valley area and some on the outskirts. Why is it that they don't put that money into financing these residencies? Because that seems to be a very serious problem. They want to build a new osteopathic medical school in Meridian, which is where I live. But the problem is they're not going to have the places to put them in residencies here. Now, what are they going to have to do? Send these people to Bangladesh or Mexico if they can't find a residency here or in another state?
Well, there are a couple of, HMOs that still fund residency programs, that operate them within their systems, like Group Health in Seattle. So they train doctors to their liking. And I don't really like the HMO pattern, but they're going to get doctors that are trained to fit that pattern. But then when Medicare came along, they took over the funding of them. And so hospitals just gave up the control. Now, medical schools, there hasn't been a for-profit medical school built since sometime around 1913 in the U.S. for the MD program. For the DO program, the osteopathic schools they have. And that's, again, governmental. because the the LCME, I can't remember the initials now, it's in the book. The credentialing committee for medical schools for the MD program will not consider a for-profit school. And if a school granting the MD degree doesn't have their credentialing, they can't get financial aid. So we haven't had medical school construction keeping up with the need for new doctors.
But we do have that going on now with this particular company that I say is coming into Meridian. I'm very skeptical about this program because of the problem with the residencies. I'm not so sure that we're going to get the benefits out of it that they say we're going to get. We have a shortage of doctors here, but if we don't have the residencies, we certainly can't bring those doctors and keep them here.
Now compare that to any other field outside of medicine. Do you have a shortage of plumbers or computer specialists or things like that? When the market demands more, people learn the skills to become those specialists. You can't do that in medicine.
No, unfortunately, you can't. I think that's why a lot of people are becoming their own doctors.
And we have an explosion in the alternative medicine industry for many of these reasons.
We'll get around to that at some point here. I wanted to touch base. You talked about you dispense drugs and you get them at a wholesale cost.
Yes, I am a drug dealer. And
yeah, well, we've got a lot of those coming across the border all the time. We'll accept you here. You do it a lot cheaper than most of the others. But I understand that you get these drugs at a very reasonable cost. And I know you were questioned by one of the legislators. It was, I think she's a pharmacist, Representative Chu. And she was questioning the efficacy of the drug you were prescribing and whether it was enough. Do you get that a lot?
Only from her, pretty much. She was questioning, she said that it takes 5 medications to control a patient with high blood pressure. If you look at the most recent release of the Joint Committee report for hypertension, it talks about using 1 or 2 drugs. Sometimes you'll need to add a third, and that's accurate. She also said that lisinopril costs $90 a month. It costs $10 for 3 months at Walmart. I called about 5 pharmacies in the Boise area. I couldn't find one that charged more than about $55 for 3 months.
Well, maybe she's getting her drugs from Mexico. She has to charge a higher price.
But the thing is, generic medications are very affordable and inexpensive, and in most cases are still the best, most highly recommended drugs for various conditions by the expert consensus committees.
So you can actually supply medications at a cheaper cost than it would cost people actually to go out and buy them sometimes.
Sometimes. For the cheaper generics like lisinopril that you get for $10 for 3 months at Walmart, I charge for 100 days $18. So I'm a little above. But on other things, I can save people sometimes $1,000 for a course of medications that would be like a 6 month or 1 year supply that they'd be paying a lot more in the pharmacy.
You realize that we're going to be investigated because we're doing a drug deal here, right?
What a doctor prescribes, he can supply.
And that's excellent.
And I'm sure the pharmacies get a lower acquisition cost than I do because of the volume. They supply the same manufacturer's medications like Teva.
We all know how the Affordable Care Act has been now in place for 3 years. Do you see us going to a single-payer system, or do you believe we can get back to a free market system and reverse Obamacare?
I can guarantee you with 100% confidence that we will never get a single-payer system. What do I mean by that? If they implement fully socialized medicine, there will be hundreds of thousands of payers, individuals who will go and pay their own way to go out of system, and even if they have to go out of country to get it,
which is what happens now with Canada. We have 45,000 people coming across the border every year.
Right.
So you actually have a 2-tier system in most of the socialized medicine countries.
You do. And but will they try to get a single payer? I think there's a good chance if they can get their so-called public option, the option to just take other people's money, a government-run health insurance plan, that will be able to suffer unbelievable losses and be propped up with taxpayer money. And it'll be the last one standing when all the other insurance companies are on the canvas.
You mean it'd be kind of like our government pension plan with Social Security?
Right. And it will be their what they call single payer, but as I
Right.
said, everybody will want to pay their own way.
You mentioned to me in one of our conversations that if a Medicaid patient has an estate and dies owing money to Medicaid, the government can attach his or her estate and leave the patient survivors with literally nothing. Is that correct?
Yes, the federal government leaves that to the states to decide whether to implement, whether to set that policy, and whether to implement that policy or not. It's a potential that's there. I don't know how much it's happening. Not much. It may happen quite a bit in the future. The potential is there. It's like inheritance tax on steroids.
What do you think about healthcare savings accounts, and would they be a viable alternative to get us out of the current system we're in? And I understand there's a tax relationship there, too, that you may not particularly care for, but just in general, would it be a partial way to get away from our current system?
Very much partial, but it does not address the root cause of the problem, and that is the tax preferment of health insurance. The whole idea behind health savings accounts is to get a tax deductibility for your out-of-pocket expenses. And so it connects the consumer with cost, which is a good thing, but it just extends the tax preference, which is the fundamental cause of our problem in the first place.
So it really, it's going to be kind of a Band-Aid on an open wound?
Exactly.
Still in trouble?
Exactly.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about charity for a minute. You state that if people had more money to spend, meaning less taxes were taken out of their pay, they would be more willing to give to charitable organizations.
Proven in the past.
Okay, but according to that, it would be only certain people who would be willing to give. And you've shown that in one of your diagrams in the book about how the Democratic-run states, voting states, give less money to charitable organizations than the Republican-run states. So you don't get an even Steven distribution, so you're still going to have those people in those Democratic states pushing for some sort of socialized medicine. So how do you actually get the charitable organizations to work to change the system? Because if they don't work, and believe me, I have firsthand knowledge of this, because when I grew up, I had doctors from the Lions Club and the Kiwanis Club who took care of me for 7-8 years of my life because my parents didn't have any money, literally. So I understand what the charity part of this is. But how do you get people to do that switch to give more to charity, and do you think it would actually happen? Because I see more people giving, not more, but less nowadays to a lot of the charities because they just don't have the money to give.
Well, I think fundamentally most people are good and giving and honest and will give when they are able to a cause that is worthy. Consider, for example, the GoFundMe website. Over $1 billion with a B funneled through that in just 1 year to charitable organizations. I think what you're describing with some people give and some people don't, it's a difference in degree. I think everybody has a charitable bone in their body, some more than others. But I think it comes down to a difference in philosophy. I like to define a liberal in the modern day misuse of the word. Liberal used to mean leaning toward freedom, Thomas Jefferson's day. But a modern day liberal likes to vote other people's money to his cause, where a modern day conservative, as we call them, gives of his own time and money to a cause in which he believes. And that actually is proven in the maps in the book that you were referring to. The states with the highest levels of charitable giving all vote Republican. The states with the the lowest levels of charitable giving all vote Democrat on the presidential campaigns of recent years.
Yeah, I've noticed that the Democrats are more than willing to contribute to the campaigns of certain politicians, but not so willing to open up their wallets when it comes to something that's a real charity in some cases.
Right. But a fundamental value of conservatism is that you help other people.
Right.
And doctors will do that if there's a need. People will do that. They'll help others. They'll give. But there's so much taken from us that not only do we not have that much left to give, but we feel like it's not our job anymore. It's the government's job. And that's a fundamental problem. Look at Social Security, for example. People have an inclination to turn to government rather than take care of their elders now.
Well, by the same token, Social Security was supposed to be a trust fund. But the only problem is you couldn't trust the government to keep it because they stole $2.5 trillion out of it. Yeah, had that money been put to work, had I just had the money that I put into Social Security, I would be so much better off than taking money from the government. I never wanted to pay Social Security, but I am forced to do that, and so is my employer. I never wanted to take Medicare. I didn't like what I saw going on with my grandmother. The problem is, how do you get them to reverse these things? Because they're so deep in debt now. You can't just turn it off. Once you open Pandora's box, you can't close it. It's the same thing with Medicaid expansion here. They keep talking about, well, we'll give it to them, and if the government doesn't come through, we'll just close it down. You can't just close it down.
No.
It doesn't work.
No. Well, I've figured out what the solutions are to the problem in some detail. I'm not saying they're going to implement them, but we will ultimately get the government we deserve. And if we don't solve these problems, fiscally, the country will collapse. There's no mathematical way around it.
What are you saying we should do? How would you see us solving the problem? If you were the president, okay, and you had carte blanche to do whatever you wanted to do, and you had a Congress that was going to do whatever you wanted to do, what would you do to solve the problem?
I think the first thing we need to do is eliminate the fundamental root cause of the problem, and that is remove the tax deductibility of health insurance so that it assumes its true value. And that means removing the deductibility but reducing tax rates so that it's not just another excuse to keep more of our money. And we also need to phase out Medicaid over a few years, Medicare over many years, not cutting off anybody that's dependent on it now, but cutting off people that can pay their own way now at whatever level of wealth that is, and not allowing any new entrants into it over a period of, I don't know, how many years, 15, however many. Those two changes would do tremendous good toward lowering healthcare costs. I would say eliminate the FDA. Now, most people, when I say that, say, oh, but we've got to have safety certification. It's precisely that reaction that would bring a safety certification from a free market group like Underwriters Laboratories does for electronics. Then it wouldn't cost $2.6 billion, as a more recent study shows, to develop a new drug. Look at the way electronics are dropping precipitously in cost. A $20,000 flat screen TV from 15 years ago can be bought for $450 today. We could be having medications developed more than we do now and not be so darn expensive. Those are a few of the things. The federal rules of civil procedure need to be reformed. They have been remade.
You're talking about the tort courts?
Right, but not just a Band-Aid by saying no awards for pain and suffering above such and such a figure, but I'm talking about rules of discovery and notice pleading and things like that, jurisdictional abuses. These are things that have been pushed into law by the legal theorists over the past several decades in order to try to generate more lawsuits. They've been wildly successful in generating more lawsuits and damaging our country. As a matter of social justice, they wanted to redistribute losses.
So you're no longer president now. You just lost your election.
Thank goodness.
So I want to get one more thing that has really always has been on my mind.
I don't want Hillary
time.
to think I'm a competitor. I might end up having to commit suicide.
Definitely not.
With a bullet wound to the back of the head.
we know we have a cost problem, and costs have been rising not just for insurance, but deductibles have been rising on insurance. The costs for procedures have been rising. They're different in a lot of different places, and I've heard you speak about this before. When you talk about transparency and costs for procedures in hospitals and charges from doctors, there is a tremendous lack of transparency, and there is no real competition or free market. We have two hospitals here. We have St. Al's, we have St. Luke's in the Treasure Valley. We also have something called the Treasure Valley Hospital, which is a for-profit hospital. Now, if you go to get a hernia operation down at the Treasure Valley Hospital, it costs you about $3,000. If you go to get the same operation at St. Luke's and use your insurance, it'll cost you between $8,000 and $10,000. How do we solve this problem to get the costs down, get more transparency, and bring free markets into play?
The first hospital you mentioned, is that the cost of the hospital and the surgeon and the anesthesiologist before insurance? Or
Yes.
is that just
No,
your part?
they're a cash only. All right, they don't take insurance. If this is a
Okay.
cash only basis.
Yeah,
okay?
there is one that does that in Oklahoma City
Okay.
for a cash basis, and that's their fee. I wasn't aware of one in Idaho.
Yeah, well, there is one. In fact, St. Luke's has just been starting to contract them to do some of their procedural work. But what you're telling me then is that what we need is more of these types of hospitals, surgery centers, that we need. Take, for instance, the MRI groups or the CT scan groups, the imaging groups. We had one here 3 years ago that used to do a CT scan or an MRI for about $500. They got taken over by St. Luke's, which has been kind of consistent here. They've been taking everybody over. And all of a sudden, the fee went up to $1,500. Now, I will tell you that the fee is now $5,700 because my wife was just in the hospital and we got the bill for it. That is absolutely out of sight. And I don't understand how we allow them to get away with doing that without somebody saying something or doing something about it. How do you stop it? I mean, how do you get a new surgery center, or how do you bring in a new imaging center?
Well, doctors would need to respond to a call and build one. There is an imaging center down near the Lake Chapala region of Mexico where a patient of mine had a CT scan done for somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 to $150.
Wow.
He doesn't remember the cost exactly. Here it would have cost well over $1,000. So most doctors aren't aware of the need for affordable imaging and surgeries. And if they were aware, and if they realized there would be less bureaucratic hassle for them, there would be a very profitable business venture, and they could be filling a great need, they might be willing to start such places. But with these other hospitals, the problem is the insurance system. It's kind of the same as in higher education, college education. The government gives a loan to anybody who has a pulse, and the schools know this. They know they can borrow as much as they need to pay the tuition, so they charge higher tuition.
So they keep raising tuitions every year, which is the same thing with the medical field.
Same thing with the medical field. The price is sort of invisible because somebody else is paying it, for the most part.
Well,
Not
that
always. Not
and
everybody's
plus
covered.
the time they get to spend with a doctor is becoming less and less. I know when I go to see my doctor, I get 15 minutes. And that's it. I mean, I'm out the door. He's got a PA in there. They do my blood pressure. They take my temperature, and then they say, oh, see you later. We've gone through a lot of things here today. You said you started in this business, and you were planning on doing something a little different, and you weren't going to do what you're doing now, and you were going to go the regular route, but you changed. And you also said that you would be willing to train doctors to do this, because it evidently is a good living. I mean, you drive a nice car. I'm sure you're living in a nice house. And I'm sure that you can have a little more freedom than most doctors do.
More freedom, yes. I've not chosen to charge the fees that would make me wealthy. I'm doing fine, but I'm not wealthy. I could charge more and be wealthy, but I choose not to. I want to make it affordable.
You think greed is a part of this whole system?
What's that?
You think greed is a part of this whole system?
I do, although most doctors don't get into it to get wealthy. But the system, the administrators, the bureaucratic end, there's a lot of greed in that.
So it's basically the system itself that is the more costly part.
Yes, and that would include the ones who lobby our Idaho legislature to keep the entrenched interests in place.
Well, you're talking about people like IACI and others that
Yes.
are working for the corporate lobbyists. Well, I think I've gotten to most everything today. We'd love to elect you president, but I don't think it's going to happen.
I wouldn't run for it.
You could be running against Hillary next time.
Hillary has a lot of dead bodies in her wake. Like I said, I don't want to commit suicide.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I want to thank you very much for coming here today and sitting down with us and having this conversation. Thank you very much for listening. This is Bob Neugebauer saying goodbye until the next time we meet. Have a good day.